Hi, my name is Lazerpig. We're here today to talk about tanks, nature's most ferocious of predators. But even these majestic, hulking behemoths are under threat from man's relentless push forward. Every year, thousands of tanks are left abandoned by their former owners, left outside to fend for themselves against the harsh wilds of nature. And many simply won't survive. But foundations like this, the Tank Museum here at Bovington, have worked tirelessly to bring these proud and noble and majestic creatures in from the cold and offer them sanctuary where they can feel safe and thrive once again. And with your help, might finally one day be released back into the wild. Come with me now as I, Lazerpig, God's greatest mistake, hobbles through this majestic cathedral of armored warfare in a desperate attempt to find just 5 things that I can talk about in a vaguely comedic way on this one-part, award-seeking documentary. That means now, come on, I've got a pie in the oven.
This video has been made possible by our supporters on Patreon, our YouTube members, and our super thanks donors. Please join them if you can, and support the Tank Museum. And thanks for watching.
Now, I know what you're thinking. Lazerpig, you might be smashing in frustration angrily into the comments, pausing only briefly to wipe some Cheeto dust from that one comfortable t-shirt you always wear, or trying desperately not to chip your delicate black nail varnish, depending on which of the 2 sides of my demographic you fall into. Lazerpig, you're a semi-serious historian. You led the charge against the Veribus in that great myth of German technical supremacy during the Second World War. So what are you doing standing in front of a king tiger, declaring it to be one of your favorites? Let me tell you a little secret, dear child. Your favorite tank does not need to be the greatest tank in the world. It can, in fact, be any tank you want. It doesn't need to be tales of its heroism sung around the campfires at night. It can be your favorite tank for whatever reason you want, justifiable to reasons only to yourself. And so it is with the King Tiger. By rights, this is an absolutely awful tank. It was ridiculously heavy. I mean, apparently they have problems with the floor cracking here every time they move the damn thing. This is solid concrete, by the way. It was overwhelmingly underpowered, it was extremely expensive, it was incredibly unreliable, it could only be used on clear days with hard ground, and it was manned exclusively by people who had been taught how to pose heroically in front of cameras more than how to man a tank. But that's not the point. The point is, it looks magnificent. Look at it! It's huge! Look at this gigantic cannon! Look at this huge chassis that it's on! It looks ferocious! You look at this thing with the same manner that you look at a monster truck. I mean, yes, a monster truck is not a practical truck. I wouldn't want to help my friends move house in one, but that's not the point. When you see a monster truck crush a Ford Anglia in an arena, it ignites something within you, that childhood wonderment deep inside you. And that is what the King Tiger is. If you give a child a crayon, this is the tank that they will draw. I want the biggest gun, and the most amount of armor, and I want it to be bigger than my house, and I want it to be bigger than Kevin's house, and I want to sit up there on the top, lording it over all the peasants in their smaller, inferior tanks. That is why I love the King Tiger. This is the Matilda II. By rights, this is not a very good tank. Now, that is going to make a lot of people very angry in the comments. I can see you. It's fine. I know. But it's not very good. I'm sorry. It's small. It's cramped. It's expensive. It was ridiculously hard to maintain. It was always breaking down. And yes, this 2-pounder gun, this 40mm, an absolutely brilliant gun back in the day in 1940, as any British person will tell you the second you mention it. In fact, I'm generally surprised one hasn't popped out already. But besides the point, the 2-pounder gun, fantastic though it was back in the day as an anti-tank gun, that wasn't really the problem the British were having in the desert. Contrary to popular belief, when the British and German tanks met each other, those great clashing jewels of armor in the desert, it would be typically the British who would have the upper hand. The Germans would then retreat, and the British would charge in after them, like the great cavalry charges of old, like the days where we fought against Napoleon at Waterloo, charging in, fighting the Germans, and following them straight into a minefield, or into a pre-designated artillery strike, or, more often than not, into an ambush by those gigantic 88mm flat cannons, which would go through most British tanks like they were made of paper. And in spite of the 2-pounder being one of the best anti-tank guns of the 1940s, trying to hit a flat gun, a big gun though it was, about 1,000 meters away while half of it's buried in a ditch to try and cover it with your little 40mm solid shot firing gun was like trying to dart a fly while sitting on a space hopper. Not an easy task. But the good thing is, the Matilda's actually, its saving grace, in fact, is its armor. 60mm at the front, which is CAS, which, thanks to the laws of energy exchange, is actually a bit more effective than flat plate. And it's this armor, this stubbornness, which made it quite slow, which meant that the lighter armored, faster British tanks would charge in to fight the Germans and would all get taken out. And then the Matilda IIs would rumble into view, and at that range, at the same range, the Flak 88 actually had trouble penetrating that frontal armor. More often than not, it would bounce off or just cause massive, huge dents. And the Matilda commanders, now seeing a battlefield with explosions going off around them, shots hitting the front of their armor, and a legion of friendly tanks in front of them, all dead and on fire, they would all simultaneously look at each other and go, "No thank you," and leave, thus saving the lives of the crew. So it would be the crew who would always look at the stubbornness of the Matilda as their saving grace, hence its name, the Queen of the Desert. But by the end of the Desert Campaign, the Matilda had been regulated to secondary roles. By the time Italy came along, it was basically just a glorified minesweeper, and by the time Normandy had come, it was basically regulated to non-combat roles or phased out entirely. Unfortunately, the tank only exists as a sort of way for Teeaboos to laud up the prowess of the great brutish tank during the Desert Campaign, just to rub it in the face of all the Americans who like to tell us that we didn't have a decent tank until the Sherman came along. I digress. But if the tank is so bad, why do I love it? Here's the secret. I've been to many a wargaming model hobby tabletop wargaming stores in my life, from ones in America to ones in Germany, to one in St. Petersburg, to ones here in Britain, to ones in that most despised, horrid pit of humanity, Birmingham. And in every single one of those places, you will always find people who look a bit like, well, me, minus the drip, of course, overweight and a little bit beardy. And each and every single one of those beardy history boys in their cardigans, starting every goddamn sentence with, "Well, here's the thing," and going off on long, hour-long temper tantrum rants about the Second World War, using facts that only they are exclusively qualified to talk about, will eventually turn and try to judge your position in this social hierarchy. And they will ask you, what is your favorite tank? This is not an honest question. They are asking this just to judge you. They want to judge you based on your choice. But I've often found, regardless of who you're talking to, regardless of where you are in the world, if you tell them, my favorite tank? Matilda II, they'll always look at you and go, nice choice. It shuts them up. That's why this will always be one of my favorites. In the days of old, when the Stonemasons Guild was actually a guild for stonemasons, they would start an apprentice stonemason off by giving him a brick, a solid, plain brick, usually made out of granite. And once that apprentice had managed to hone his skill enough and carve it into a perfect sphere, then his apprenticeship was decreed over and he was declared a master. In our amateur yet dramatic historian society, anyone who is just getting into the weird, whimsical, and wonderful yet very sweaty world of World War II history will be told that the Tiger is the best tank of the Second World War. It had the best gun, it had the best armor. It was the best tank that Germany could make at the time. In fact, in its debut in 1942, it was practically invincible. Almost nothing could take it down. It was the most powerful and the most advanced tank of the war for about 2 years. And then you're told that the Sherman was overall a better tank. The Sherman with its weaker armor and weaker gun. You've just been handed a brick. And by the time you can explain to us why the Sherman is a better tank than the Tiger, you'll have crafted that brick into a sphere. And your apprenticeship will be decreed as over. You have become the master. But of course, we don't have time for you to carve bricks into spheres, so I'm just going to tell you what the answer is anyway. You could pretend that you made it up, and then everyone will be very impressed with you. Anyway. Now, yes, you can get a Tiger and a Sherman in a field, have them point at each other over open sights, and the Tiger will win that battle each and every time. So why does that make the Sherman a better tank? Well, let me tell you the secret, dear child. You see, when the Sherman gets destroyed, its crew statistically survive. They get out of the tank, they walk back to the depot, and they get another Sherman. And then they get 5 of their Sherman buddies to come along because, hey, there's a Tiger in that field, let's go get it. And then when the Tiger gets destroyed, the crew get out, they walk back to the depot, and there isn't another Tiger there waiting on them. In fact, there probably won't ever be a Tiger there waiting on them. In fact, most Tiger crews would spend the latter half of the war manning field guns or being infantry. You see, the problem is the Tiger is a very, very complicated machine, as I'm sure the maintenance crew here at the Tank Museum will happily tell you. It required special imports, mainly tungsten, which had to come from Turkey. It required special craftsmen with special dedicated tools and special precision machine equipment to build. And when it was built, it required its own special train carriage, which required its own special tracks to be moved from the factory. It needed its own special crane to hoist it up onto said track or onto a boat if it needed to be moved for God knows whatever reason. It needed its own special maintenance crew who needed their own special vehicle, and so on and so forth. You get the picture. The Sherman, however, didn't need any of that. The Sherman could be built in a car factory by semi-skilled labor in around 3 hours, give or take. Well, some factories claim they could do it in an hour, but I wouldn't like to test that theory. It didn't need its own special rail carriage. It didn't need its own special crane. It could be placed on any rail carriage you want. It could be lifted by any crane that you'd typically find in any US dockyard. Therefore, it could be shipped by pretty much any boat anywhere. It could be built in the thousands. It could be shipped in the thousands, and it could be deployed in the thousands, crewed by pretty much anyone and maintained by pretty much anyone with just a little bit of training. Whereas the Tiger took about 2 weeks to build. The Sherman, on the other hand, could be built, shipped across America, shipped across the Atlantic, outfitted for combat in England, and then shipped to the front lines in less than a week. The Tiger took 2 weeks just to build alone, which meant that by the time that Tiger was finally arriving at the front lines, 700 Shermans had now arrived in France. And that is the beauty of the Sherman. That is the genius behind its design. It's very easy to build big and say, I want the biggest gun and the most amount of crap and the most amount of technology and a huge chassis that's like a gigantic behemoth, than it is to build small and build clever. Than it is to build using what already exists, taking advantage of existing technology, existing things that you can find around you, existing infrastructure, and then build it in such a way that it could be crewed by anyone and maintained by anyone with nothing but a hammer, a spanner, and a roll of duct tape. And that is why I love the Sherman, and that is why it's a better tank than the Tiger. This choice may seem controversial, but I am, if anything, a man of controversy. This is the T-72. In my opinion, one of the worst tanks ever mass-produced of the modern age. So why is it my favorite? Allow me to explain, because you're probably confused. So, Some of you in the military analyst community may be aware of a group of individuals called, politely, the Reformers. Started in the 1970s by a Pentagon think tank called the Fighter Plane Mafia. These are a group of individuals who rely far too much on grand, expensive, unproven technologies. These unproven technologies being, of course, radar and missiles and what have you. And that these weapons only exist to fill the retirement paycheck of some fat-bottom Pentagon general. They instead believe that in order to win a war against, say, Russia or China, we should instead be concentrating on rugged and reliable technologies, and therefore we should flood the battlefield with cheaply made, simple and basic weapons and win a future war entirely on numbers against Russia and China. I'm sure you can see the flaw in their argument. But thankfully, in our reality, the Reformers lost the argument. They spent most of their time in the Pentagon rallying against the F-15 and wasting all this taxpayers' money building their own version of the F-15 fighter jet they called Project Redbird, which they attempted to sell to Congress by whipping the public and the press into a frenzy, calling it a turkey, saying it was too heavy to dogfight, blah, blah, blah. It would never win a fight against the rugged and reliable MiG-21. And then, of course, the F-15 turned out to be the most successful fighter jet of all time, with over 200 kills to absolutely zero losses at the time of recording. That could change. So then they changed tactics. They went after the M1 Abrams. It's a turkey, it's too heavy, it's too stupid, it's built on all this unprovable technology. The M60 is far more reliable, and the M1 Abrams will be completely decimated by Saddam Hussein's legion of rugged and reliable Soviet-built tanks. And then Operation Desert Storm happened, and not a single M1 Abrams was lost to enemy action. You may question where I'm going with this. Be patient. You see, while in our world, in the West, while the Reformers lost and were left humiliated, only recently made a resurgence when they replayed all their old material about the F-35, you know, it's a turkey, it can't fly, it can't dogfight, blah, 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 you get the picture. In the Soviet Union, they won. The Soviet Reformers believed that Russia's greatest strength has always been its ability to outpopulate and outproduce its opponents. And in war, yes, having a professional army and having expensive and brilliant equipment is perfectly fine, but attrition does happen. And those losses take time and take a lot of money to replace. Eventually, you're going to be down to peasant farmers with AK-47s in their hand, screaming "Ura" and charging across the minefield. So any technology that is beyond their ability to understand is not particularly worth the money. And thus, the T-72 was born. This is a product of ego. Ural blatantly refused to produce a tank of a leading rival, Kharkiv, this foreign government in Ukraine building their own tank. Absolutely not. So instead, he took a T-62, lengthened the chassis, put a better turret in it, gave it an autoloader, and called it the Ural, just to make sure that everybody knew he made it, not someone else. And then he marketed it as a sort of cheaper mobilization variant of the T-64, which was going through some problems at the time. Forgetting, of course, to mention that by the time he'd actually built the tank that we now know and love as the T-72, it was actually more expensive than the T-64-8. But don't tell anyone that, okay? They get angry at you. And for that expense, you don't exactly get much. You get an autoloader that will reload each round at about 10 seconds, by which point the Abrams has fired back at you twice. It is infamously cramped. It is ridiculously hard to see out of. And the most advanced technology on board is its spaced armor, which means there is a gap between the armor. It's a fancy way of saying, which would have been very impressive had the Nazi Germans not been doing it 20 years previously. In spite of being the poster child for the rugged and reliable, it is in fact famously unreliable. It has an engine that's a supercharged variant of an old V2 engine from the T-34. The vibrations of which were so bad, the hull would actually start to crack in half, which meant the whole thing had to be reinforced, and they had to build these massive rubber road wheels onto the tires. The vibrations, of course, would continue to be a problem. The tank can barely fire while on the move. It is, in fact, slower than many tanks which are heavier than it, and if it takes a shot to the armor, the entire turret launches into the stratosphere, merrily cremating its crew over a wide radius, as seen very recently all over the internet. And it gets worse. Production variants of these things were not standardized. T-72s that were built in Czechoslovakia were completely different to T-72s built in Eastern Germany, which were completely different to T-72s built in the Soviet Union, Russia. Which meant that the crews couldn't exchange spare parts, they couldn't exchange tools, they could barely exchange crew members, which meant the great union of the Soviets couldn't share supply lines. You can see a flaw in their brilliant plan to take on the West. So if this tank is so bad, why do I love it so much? That's the thing. Can you imagine how differently things would be going now if the Soviets had made the correct economical choice and decided that they needed a large professional army, complete with some of the most powerful and some of those brilliant weapons that they could produce at the time? Can you imagine how differently Desert Storm would have gone if the Abrams and the Challenger had met tanks that were their equal? Can you imagine how differently things would be going now in the battlefields of today if Russia's army was the equivalent of the United States and not equipped with things like this? Something to think about. I've decided through my might and majesty and completely non-British bias that this is my favorite tank, the Challenger 2, the greatest tank in the world currently, fighting in Ukraine with an attrition loss of exactly 1 to a mine. If you disagree, leave a comment. I won't read it. Slava Ukraine. And that is the story of why little Hitler did not get any Christmas presents that year. Hello, my name's been Lazerpig. I've been allowed into the Tank Museum for reasons I'm sure they are now currently regretting to talk about tanks. I am a self-proclaimed historian. I am a self-proclaimed expert on tanks. I know everything because of that, and if you disagree, I'm here, you're not. This is the Tank Museum, supported on Patreon. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Support them if you... They told me to say support them on Patreon if you can. I'm not saying that. I'm saying support the Tank Museum on Patreon. Do it now, you goddamn cowards. Do it right now, or you know what will happen. I'm coming after you. I know where you live. I'm Lazerpig.